Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story. For 38 years, I delivered the mail on Willow Bend Street, and I thought I knew every door on that block by heart. Then one Sunday morning, I came around the corner in my church clothes and found one of those doors standing wide open with an 81-year-old woman's whole life stacked up in cardboard boxes on the porch beside it. My name is Jesse Pugh. I am 76 years old, and I have lived in Carver Heights on the east side of Houston since before half these new coffee shops and glass apartment buildings decided our neighborhood was worth noticing. I walked this block delivering letters and birthday cards and the occasional overdue bill for 38 years before I ever retired, and in all that time, I never once had trouble getting into a door I didn't already know the sound of. That Sunday, I was walking home from the 10 o'clock service at Mount Zion, still humming the last hymn under my breath, when I saw the moving truck parked crooked against the curb outside the little yellow house on the corner. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up to why it should. That house belonged to me, had belonged to me for almost 20 years, and the woman standing on the porch in her housecoat, clutching a framed photograph to her chest like it might be taken from her too, was Odell Fairweather, 81 years old, who had lived in that house since her husband passed, and who paid me $200 less than market rent every single month because I told her a long time ago that some things matter more than money. Mr. Pugh. Her voice cracked when she saw me, relief and terror fighting for the same breath. She was still in her housecoat and slippers, a rosary wound twice around her wrist, and behind her the young man was already carrying out the little bookshelf where she kept her late husband's photographs. Mr. Pugh, they said, I have 30 days. They said the house has new owners now. A young man in a polo shirt with a realtor's logo stitched over the pocket was taping a folder shut by the mailbox, not even looking up. I asked him who sent him. He told me a name I did not recognize from a company I had never heard of, and said the paperwork had come through a family representative only 2 days before. Family representative. Those two words sat wrong in my mouth even before I understood what they meant. I had spent 4 decades reading the return addresses on other people's mail, learning to tell a debt collector's envelope from a birthday card, without ever opening either one. Something about that phrase told me this particular piece of business, whatever it truly was, had been written from inside my own house. I have never sold that house. I have never once considered it. I bought it back when my wife Odessa was still alive. Back when this street was full of families the banks would not lend to and the city would not pave properly. And I made myself a promise that as long as I had breath in my body, nobody on this block who had earned a little peace in their old age was going to lose it to somebody else's idea of progress. I told the young man there was some mistake, that I was the owner, that no paper carried my signature because I had signed nothing at all. He looked at me the way people look at an old man they have already decided is confused. And he said the paperwork had been filed properly, and if I had questions, I should take them up with my family. My family. I helped Odell carry 2 of her boxes back inside and told her not to touch another thing until I got this straightened out. I held her hand a moment because it was shaking worse than mine. Then I walked the 4 blocks to my own house faster than I had walked anywhere in 10 years, my heart beating out a rhythm I did not like the sound of. Carver Heights does not look like it used to. Half the houses on my old route have been bought up, gutted, painted gray, and sold again for 4 times what the families who raised their children there ever dreamed the place was worth. I never minded the new faces moving in. What I minded was watching the old ones get pushed out, quiet, one signature at a time, until nobody was left who remembered why the street was called Willow Bend in the first place. I had spent 20 years buying up whatever small houses I could afford on a mail carrier's pension, one at a time, and renting them cheap to people like Odell, people I had watched raise their grandchildren on this block, so that at least a few doors on this street would never go up for sale. I believed I had protected that. I believed after everything I had built something that could not be taken. By the time I reached my own porch, my hands were not steady, and it had nothing to do with my age. My son Dante's car was in the driveway. So was his wife Kylie's. Through the front window, I could see the both of them sitting in the living room, and something about the stillness of that room, the way neither one moved toward the door despite hearing my footsteps on the porch, told me before I ever touched the handle that whatever had happened to Odell Fairweather's house had started right here inside my own. I stood there a moment longer than I needed to, one hand resting on the knob I had installed with my own 2 hands the summer I bought this place. 38 years, and I had never once had trouble getting into a house on this street. Then I turned the handle and stepped inside to find out exactly what my family had done. The living room went quiet the moment I crossed the threshold. The particular kind of quiet that told me every word worth saying had already been said before I ever walked in. There was a folder already sitting open on the coffee table between them, its papers fanned out like they had been arranged for a photograph. Beside it sat a business card I did not recognize, the kind of heavy cream stock that cost somebody real money to print. Nobody in that room looked surprised to see me standing in my own doorway. They looked like people who had been waiting. Dante was standing by the fireplace, his eyes fixed on the carpet like it might tell him what to say. Kylie was seated on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded in her lap, watching me the way you watch a kettle you already know is about to boil. I did not raise my voice. 38 years of knocking on strangers' doors taught me that a raised voice gets you nowhere. A steady one cannot get you faster. I asked them plainly what had happened to Odell Fairweather's house. I asked who had the authority to send a man with a folder and a moving truck to an old woman's porch on a Sunday morning. Dante opened his mouth and closed it again twice like a man rehearsing a line he could not make himself say out loud. It was Kylie who answered, and she answered like she had been waiting all morning for exactly that question. "Dad," she said, "we didn't want you to find out this way. We were going to sit down with you properly, all 3 of us, later today. Find out what I asked her." She reached toward the coffee table and slid the folder across it thick with paper, a county seal stamped in the corner of the top page. She told me that 2 weeks earlier, after I had fainted in my own garden in the middle of a Houston afternoon, Dante had gotten so frightened for me that he had gone to a lawyer, and the lawyer had helped them file for what she called emergency financial guardianship. I remembered that afternoon clearly enough. I had been out pulling weeds past noon without near enough water in me, and I had sat down hard in the grass, and a neighbor 2 doors down had seen me from her porch and called Dante in a panic. I had been back on my feet inside of 20 minutes, embarrassed more than anything, drinking sweet tea on my own porch by supper time. That was not a health crisis, I told them. That was an old man forgetting to drink water on a hot day. Dante finally looked up. "Dad, it scared me," he said, his voice thinner than I remembered it being. "You were on the ground. You weren't answering when I called your name. Not at first." I asked him how signing away control of my finances to a lawyer neither of us had ever met had one single thing to do with a man drinking too little water in his own yard. Then I asked the question that mattered more. I asked how a piece of paper filed 3 days ago could already have reached all the way to a rental house 4 blocks from here, into the hands of a real estate agent I had never laid eyes on. That house was not named anywhere in whatever petition a judge had agreed to hear. I wanted to know who had connected those 2 things, and why it had happened before I even knew there was anything to connect. Kylie's smile did not move, but something behind her eyes recalculated. She said the guardianship filing gave Dante temporary signing authority over any property tied to my estate, effective the moment it was filed, and that the agent handling Odell's house must simply have been notified as a matter of routine procedure. She said it the way a person reads a page they have memorized, rather than one they have actually thought about. I did not believe a single word of that sentence, though I could not yet have told you which part of it was the lie. Kylie's voice stayed even, almost gentle, the way you would talk a child down from a tantrum. She said the guardianship was only precautionary, that it gave them the legal footing to manage things properly if my health ever did decline, that the Fairweather situation had been a misunderstanding by an overeager agent who had jumped ahead of the paperwork, and that she would personally see it corrected first thing in the morning. I asked her when a judge was supposed to hear any of this. She told me the hearing was set for 12 days from now at the Harris County Courthouse, and that a court-appointed evaluator, a specialist she had already spoken with personally, would be coming by sometime later that same week to assess my, as she put it, current capacity. 12 days. I turned that number over in my head, the way I used to turn over an address I could not quite place on my old route, searching for what street it belonged to. Dante would not meet my eyes at all now. He had retreated fully behind his wife's calm, steady voice, the way a man retreats behind a locked door when he no longer trusts his own hands on the knob. Kylie rose from the sofa, smoothed her skirt, and carried the folder across the room to press it gently into my hands, her fingers cool against mine. "We're only trying to protect you, Dad," she said, her eyes soft, her voice full of something that almost passed for love. "That's all any of this ever was. You believe that, don't you?" That evening, once the house had gone quiet and Dante and Kylie had gone upstairs, I sat alone at my kitchen table with those guardianship papers still unsigned in front of me, and I found myself looking past them at the photograph on the wall instead. Odessa and I were married 50 years before the good Lord took her home 6 years ago. And in that photograph, she is 22 years old, in a borrowed white dress, laughing at something just out of frame, her hand resting light on my arm like she already knew exactly how the next 50 years were going to go. I do not remember what she was laughing at anymore. I only remember that I decided right then I would spend the rest of my life trying to earn that particular laugh again. It was Odessa who taught me what a house was actually worth. Not the number of bank puts on it, but the number of Sundays it holds, the number of grandchildren who learn to walk across its floors. 3 years into our marriage, an elderly widow $2 down from our first little rental got a notice that her rent was doubling, and Odessa marched over there with a pound cake and came home an hour later having quietly promised the woman we would help however we could. We could not do much back then. We were barely keeping our own lights on. But I never forgot the look on Odessa's face that evening, like she had found the one thing in this life worth working for besides me. After she passed, I kept buying up whatever small houses I could manage on a mail carrier's pension, one at a time, and renting them at prices that made my accountant shake his head every year at tax time. Some years I managed one house. Some years, with a little overtime, I managed two. I never explained the full truth of it to Dante. He had grown up watching his mother love this neighborhood and seemed to assume I kept it up out of habit, an old coat I wore for sentiment rather than conviction. He never understood that for me, every closing paper I signed was another conversation I got to keep having with a woman who was no longer in the room to have it with me. Dinner that night was a quiet, careful thing. The kind where everyone passes the butter a little too politely because nobody trusts what will happen if the room goes silent for too long. Aliyah sat across from me, picking at her rice, 17 years old, going on 40, watching her parents with the particular caution of a girl who has learned to read a room before she has learned much else. Dante himself barely spoke at all, pushing his food around his plate with the distracted care of a man doing arithmetic in his head that never once came out even. Kylie tried to fill the silence the way she always did, with talk that sounded warm on the surface and never quite was underneath. She got onto the subject of the neighborhood somehow, the new coffee shop 2 streets over, the young couples moving in with their renovation budgets. And then she said something that made Dante's fork stop halfway to his mouth. "It really is a shame," she said, "letting all that property just sit there collecting dust, rent, when the whole street around it is worth 3 times what it was 5 years ago." People get so sentimental about a few old houses, but at some point, sentiment is just money left on the table. Nobody said anything for a moment. Kylie must have felt it because she laughed, then a bright little laugh, and reached over to squeeze my hand. "I'm only teasing, Dad," she said. "You know I love this old neighborhood as much as you do." I did not believe that either, though I said nothing and let the moment pass, because I have learned in 76 years that the things people say while laughing are sometimes the truest things they say all day. After the plates were cleared, Aliyah lingered in the kitchen while I dried the last of the dishes, hovering the way she used to hover as a little girl when she had something on her mind too big for her to carry alone by herself. I asked her what was troubling her. She told me that a few days back, waiting in the car while her mother ran an errand, she had watched Kylie meet a man in a gray suit in the parking lot outside a coffee shop on Alameda Road. A man she had never seen before, and the two of them had talked for a long time, with their heads bent close together over something Kylie kept folded inside a manila envelope. She said the man never raised his voice and never smiled either. The whole conversation carried out in the particular hush of two people who already agree on something and are only working out the details. I set the dish towel down slowly on the counter. Something in my chest went still and sharp all at once. The same feeling I used to get sorting mail on a slow afternoon when one envelope in the stack felt heavier in my hand than it had any business being. I asked her if she had heard anything the two of them said. She shook her head but told me that just an hour before dinner, passing her mother's half-open bedroom door, she had heard Kylie's voice low and certain, saying 5 words that had stuck to her ever since. 5 words she had not known what to do with until she saw the look on my face at that table tonight. "Don't worry," Aliyah told me. "He won't be a problem." It took me 3 days to find the courage to go looking for something I was fairly sure I did not want to find. Kylie had left that Thursday morning for what she called a hair appointment, though she came home from those appointments looking exactly the way she had left. Which was one more small thing I had started noticing since the night Aliyah stood in my kitchen with dish soap still on her hands. Dante was at what remained of his office, chasing numbers that never seemed to add up the way he needed them to. The house was mine alone for the first time in longer than I could remember, and I stood in the hallway outside the room they used as an office and made myself walk in. I am not proud of what I did next. A man does not spend 76 years believing in a person's right to their own privacy and then go rifling through his daughter-in-law's things without feeling the weight of it settle somewhere behind his ribs. But I kept thinking about that cream-colored business card I had seen sitting on my own coffee table, the one nobody in that room had bothered to explain. And I kept hearing Aliyah's 5 words in my head, like a hymn I could not stop humming. I found the folder in the bottom drawer of Kylie's desk, beneath a stack of yoga catalogs she never seemed to order from. It was thick, official-looking, the kind of paperwork that costs a company good money to have printed, rather than simply typed. Across the top, in raised gold lettering, it read, "Woodward Development Group," and beneath that, a name I recognized. The way you recognize a name that has floated around the edges of a neighborhood for years without ever quite landing on you directly. Judson Woodward. I had heard that name before, here and there, at the barber shop at church, in the particular way people lower their voices when they talk about a man who has bought up half a dozen blocks on the west side of the city and left a trail of small, ruined business owners behind him wherever his projects move through. I thought of Ronnie Castellanos, who used to run the tire shop on Scott Street, before Woodward Development bought up the block around him and left Ronnie standing alone behind a chain-link fence promising a lease renewal that never came. Ronnie used to say Woodward had looked him dead in the eye and called him a valued partner not 2 weeks before the lawyer's letter arrived, ending everything between them. Folks said Judson Woodward was the kind of man who would shake your hand warmly right up until the moment you stopped being useful to him, and after that he would not remember your name at all. Inside the folder was a letter of interest dated 3 weeks earlier, addressed not to Dante Pugh and not to the Pugh family, but to Kylie Pugh directly, care of an email address I did not recognize. It outlined an offer to acquire 4 residential properties on Willow Bend Street, listed by their exact addresses. Every one of them a house I owned. A house I had spent 20 years filling with people the city had already tried once to push out. A single sticky note was folded inside the front cover. Kylie's handwriting slanted and quick. 3 words underlined twice. Move before Friday. I read the letter twice, my finger tracing each line, the way I used to trace an address I could not quite make out in somebody's hurried handwriting, searching for the shape of the truth underneath the shape of the ink. There was nothing in those pages about protecting an old man from himself. There was nothing about guardianship or health or capacity. Not one word of it. There was only a valuation, a projected return, and a signature line still waiting, patient as a spider, for somebody to fill it in with my name. I sat down slowly in Kylie's desk chair, the folder open across my knees, and let the truth settle into me, the way cold water settles into your boots before you feel it climbing your legs. I had spent 3 days assuming, without ever quite saying it to myself, that whatever trouble was coming for this family had my son's name written somewhere on it. Dante was the one drowning in debt. Dante was the one who flinched every time his phone rang. It had never once occurred to me that the hand steering this whole thing toward my 4 houses might not belong to my son at all. And for the first time since that Sunday morning outside Odell's house, I found myself wondering whether my own boy understood any better than I did what his wife was truly capable of. I closed the folder exactly the way I had found it, tucked it back beneath the yoga catalog she would never open, and slid the drawer shut without a sound. I straightened the chair, smoothed the carpet where my shoe had left a mark, and walked out of that room the same way I had walked in, careful as a man diffusing something that could still go off in his hands. That evening, I sat across from Kylie at the dinner table and let her tell me all about her hair appointment in more detail than I had ever asked for. And I nodded along and asked polite questions about the salon. And not once did my hands shake or my voice waver, though inside my chest, a fire had already been lit that no amount of politeness was ever going to put back out. Don't let them know you know, I told myself. Not yet. Somewhere around midnight, unable to lie still any longer, I reached into the nightstand drawer and pulled out an address book I had kept since before most of the numbers in it still worked. Its leather cover soft and dark from 40 years of handling pages, gone the color of strong tea. I flipped past names I had not called in a decade, past Odessa's handwriting, still filling half the margins where she used to correct my spelling of somebody's last name, until I found the one I was looking for, under the letter S. Quentin Small. Quentin and I served together, back when the two of us still had good knees and less sense than God gave a goose. We had buried each other's fathers, stood as best man at each other's weddings, and once, many years back, driven 11 straight hours through the night so Quentin could still make it to his daughter's graduation after his truck broke down outside Beaumont. In the 50 years since basic training, he had become the kind of friend a man only gets to keep 2 or 3 of in a whole lifetime. The kind who does not ask why you are calling at midnight, only whether you are safe first and what you need second. He picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice gravel rough with sleep and a little startled. I told him I was sorry for the late hour. I told him I needed to talk to him about the arrangement we made 8 years ago. The one we had both quietly hoped I would never actually need to use. There was a long pause on the line. When Quentin spoke again, all the sleep had gone out of his voice. "You mean it, Jesse?" he said. "You are not just talking." I told him I meant it. 8 years ago, not long after Odessa's heart first started giving her trouble, and I lay awake more nights than I could count, wondering what would happen to everything we had built if I went before I got the chance to protect it properly. I had gone to a lawyer with an idea Quentin thought was half genius and half foolish, and together the 3 of us had built something quiet and careful into the paperwork of my life, something I had prayed for 8 years I would never have a reason to wake up. I did not explain the details to Quentin that night. He already knew them better than I did. I only needed to hear him say the 2 words that mattered. "It still stands," he told me, "every bit of it. You just say the word." I thanked him, told him I would be in touch soon, and hung up before either one of us could turn sentimental about it. My next call went to Thomas Whitaker, the lawyer who had drawn up that arrangement 8 years back. Whitaker was not the kind of lawyer who advertised on the side of a city bus. Quentin had found him for me, a quiet, careful man who had spent 30 years doing exactly the sort of unglamorous, airtight work that never makes the evening news and never once needs to be redone. And I trusted him with things these days I would not have trusted to my own son. He answered groggy but alert, the way good lawyers learn to, and I asked him only one question: whether the paperwork we filed all those years ago still held exactly as written. "It does, Mr. Pugh," he said. "Nothing about it has changed." "Has something happened?" I told him. I would explain everything soon, but for now, I needed him ready to move the moment I called again. I found Aliyah awake too when I finally came out into the hallway, sitting on the top stair in her socks, the way she used to as a little girl when the house felt too big and too quiet to sleep in. I sat down beside her and pressed something small and plastic into her palm. A prepaid phone I had bought with cash from a drugstore 3 towns over the week before. Back before I had even fully known what I was preparing myself for. "Keep this charged and keep it hidden," I told her. "If you ever need me and cannot use your own phone, this is how you reach me. Do not tell your mother it exists. Do not tell your father either, not yet. She looked down at the phone, then back up at me, and asked me plainly what was happening. Someday soon, I will tell you everything I told her. Tonight, I only need you to trust that your grandfather has not spent all these years sitting in this house doing nothing. She nodded slowly, slid the phone into the pocket of her pajama pants, and hugged me tighter and longer than she had in a long while, before padding back down the hallway toward her own room. After she was gone, I stood alone at my window for a long while, looking out over Carver Heights toward the streets I had walked with a mailbag on my shoulder for 38 years. 38 years teaches a man where every crack in every sidewalk sits where every dog will bark and every porch light burns out too soon before anybody bothers fixing it. What it does not teach you is how to sit still once you finally understand that the danger walking toward everything you love is not coming from outside those streets at all. It is already living under your own roof, sleeping down the hall, calling you Dad. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after I had given Aliyah that little phone, and I knew before I ever reached the door that whoever stood on the other side of it had been sent to build a case against me. She introduced herself as Dr. Renata Kessler, a geriatric cognitive specialist, though she never once asked to see any identification confirming as much. And I never once asked either, because a man who has already decided to play the fool cannot afford to seem too sharp about the details. She carried a leather briefcase the same shade of brown as the folder I had found in Kylie's desk, and something about that color appearing twice in 1 week in my own house sat in my stomach like a stone I had swallowed whole. Kylie met her at the door like an old friend, all warm hands and lowered voice, guiding her into the living room, where 2 chairs had already been arranged facing each other, close enough that a man being questioned would have nowhere comfortable to look except directly into his questioner's eyes. Dr. Kessler opened her briefcase and pulled out a clipboard, and for the better part of an hour, she asked me questions in the particular rhythm of someone who already knew what answer she wanted and was only waiting to see how long it took me to fail to give it to her. She asked me the date. I gave it to her plainly. She asked me to name the current president, then the one before him, and I gave her both without hesitating, though I let just enough silence sit between the 2 answers to seem like a man taking his time rather than a man performing carefulness on purpose. Then she asked me to count backward from 100 by 7s out loud without stopping, and I did it slower than I could have, slower than 38 years of doing arithmetic on my feet, sorting mail would have ever allowed. Because I had already decided somewhere around the 3rd question that the safest place for me to stand in this house was 1 step behind whatever they expected of me. She asked me to draw a clock face from memory and mark it at 10 minutes past 11, and I drew it a little crooked on purpose. The numbers bunched slightly too close together on the right side. Not so crooked that any honest doctor would call it concerning, but crooked enough to give a dishonest one something to circle in red later. She asked me how my mood had been lately, and I told her fine, though fine was doing a great deal of work in that one small sentence. Twice during that hour, Kylie interjected with a soft, worried aside about some small incident I supposedly could not recall clearly. Incidents I had no memory of, because, as far as I could tell, they had never actually happened at all. It was her 7th or 8th question that told me everything I needed to know about what this appointment truly was. "Do you ever feel, Mr. Pugh," she asked, her pen already moving before I answered, "like the people closest to you might be trying to take advantage of you in some way?" I looked at Kylie sitting on the arm of the sofa with her hand pressed to her chest, watching me with an expression built entirely out of concern and containing not one true thing underneath it. I thought about the folder in her desk drawer. I thought about Aliyah's 5 words. I wanted more than I have wanted almost anything in 76 years to say yes, and to watch what happened to that carefully arranged concern on Kylie's face when I did. Instead, I told Dr. Kessler that I had a wonderful family who worried about me more than I probably deserved, and that any man my age who did not feel a little uncertain about the future was not paying close enough attention to it. She wrote something down. I could not see what. By the end of the hour, my head ached from the effort of appearing tired rather than sharp, and Dr. Kessler closed her folder with the satisfied air of a woman who had gotten exactly the material she came for, regardless of what I had actually said to earn it. She told Kylie, not me, that the results warranted continued observation, and that in situations like this one, families generally found it helpful to have a trained care assistant present in the home during the day. Someone who could offer support and keep a gentle eye on things until the court date arrived. Kylie thanked her with tears standing bright and unfired in her eyes. Tears, I now understood. The way you understand a magic trick once somebody has shown you exactly where the extra card is hidden. Dr. Kessler left a card on the coffee table on her way out, the same brown as her briefcase, and told us a young woman named Denise would be arriving Friday morning to begin, as she put it, a period of supportive daily care. I understood exactly what that meant. Friday they were sending someone to watch me. I walked Dr. Kessler to the door myself, thanked her for her time, the way my mother raised me to thank anyone who crossed my threshold, and stood on the porch a moment after her car pulled away, counting the days I had left before that courthouse date, the way I used to count the houses left on a route before quitting time. 9 days now. 9 days and a stranger named Denise arriving Friday to make sure I did not use a single one of them wisely. The hook by the back door where I have kept my truck keys for 11 years running was empty when I reached for it one morning several days after Denise moved in, and for one confused second, I stood there patting my own pockets like a man checking for his own reflection in a mirror that had gone missing off the wall overnight. Denise found me still standing there a few minutes later. She had been staying with us close to a week by then, having arrived that first Friday with one small suitcase and a manner so careful and so quiet that I understood right away she had done this particular job in other houses before mine. She was young, younger than Elia's own mother, probably with tired eyes and a folder of her own tucked under her arm, though hers was thin and official in a different way than Dr. Kessler's had been. The kind of paperwork that belongs to someone doing a job rather than building a case against a man. She offered me coffee before I could even ask for it, and there was something in the quick, practiced kindness of the gesture that told me she had learned in whatever houses came before mine that a little decency costs nothing and sometimes makes a hard job easier to live with afterward. I decided, watching her hands move a little unsteadily around the coffee pot, that Denise was probably not my enemy. She was simply somebody's employee, standing exactly where the money had told her to stand. I asked her plainly as plain as I could manage whether she had seen my truck keys anywhere at all. She told me, not quite meeting my eyes, that Kylie had mentioned something about the truck needing servicing and that it had already been taken to a shop that very morning while I was still fast asleep upstairs. She said it the careful way people say things they have been told to say and privately doubt themselves. I did not press her further. I have learned enough in 76 years to know that pressing the messenger rarely gets you anything but a more careful messenger the next time around. And a more careful messenger tells you even less than the first one did. It was on my way back through the kitchen that I discovered the second thing missing from my life that morning. The little brass mailbox key I had kept on my ring since the day I retired, more sentiment than necessity, since I had not needed to check my own mail with any urgency in years, no longer opened anything at all. Someone had installed a new lock on the box out at the curb sometime in the last 2 days, and when I mentioned it to Denise, she told me again without meeting my eyes that Kylie was the only one holding a key to it. Now, something about consolidating important paperwork so nothing got lost or misdirected during a stressful time. A man spends 38 years putting other people's mail into their hands and learns something important about what a locked box really means. It does not mean your mail is safe. It means somebody has already decided you are no longer trusted with your own correspondence, which is a particular kind of small, cold theft that never once shows up on any police report. I thought again about the folder I had found in Kylie's desk drawer 9 days earlier about Woodward Development Group and a signature line waiting patient as a spider for my name. A locked mailbox and a borrowed truck were small things by themselves, easy enough to explain away to any judge as simple caution around an aging man. But small things stacked carefully enough and quickly enough have a way of becoming a wall before the man standing behind them even understands he has been fenced in. I was standing at the kitchen window a little while later, working out how I might reach Quentin or Whitaker with my truck gone, and my own phone likely watched now too, when I heard Kylie's voice coming sharp and low from the hallway, a register I had not heard from her before. Nothing at all like the honeyed voice she used at dinner tables and doctor's appointments. I could not make out most of what she said. The words came in fragments through the wall. A name I did not recognize. Something about a timeline. Something about Friday not being soon enough anymore. I caught one more fragment before her voice dropped too low to follow. 4 words that made no sense to me yet, and would not stop repeating themselves in my head for the rest of that day. He still doesn't know. The call ended abruptly, and a moment later, I heard her heels clicking back toward the kitchen, her voice already rearranging itself into its familiar gentle shape before she ever came around the corner to find me. I did not have proof of anything solid yet. I only had a locked mailbox, a missing truck, and a voice I had just heard through a wall that did not match the woman smiling warmly at me now from the doorway, asking if I had eaten breakfast. I tore a small corner from a grocery receipt still in my pocket, wrote 4 words on it with the stub of a pencil I kept for crossword puzzles, folded it twice, and closed my fist around it, tight enough to feel the corner bite into my palm. Waiting for the next moment, Alaya and I might find ourselves alone in the same room, away from Denise's careful eyes and whatever Kylie had meant by 4 words of her own. Alaya showed up Saturday morning with a backpack full of algebra homework she had no intention of doing, which told me right away she understood exactly what kind of visit this needed to look like from the outside. Denise let her in with a polite smile and went back to whatever she had been doing in the kitchen, close enough to hear us if we raised our voices far enough that ordinary conversation would pass right by her without much notice. Alaya settled at the dining table, spread her textbook open to a page of equations, and asked me loud enough for anyone listening to hear whether I remembered how to do long division. I sat down across from her, picked up her pencil, and while I worked through a problem I did not need any help with, I slid the folded corner of that grocery receipt across the table beneath my palm. My hands are not as steady as they used to be, and passing a scrap of paper without drawing attention takes a kind of nerve I had not called on since I was young enough to sneak love letters to Odessa past her mother's watchful eye. Denise's footsteps paused once out in the hallway, close enough that my heart climbed halfway up my throat, but she had only stopped to straighten a picture frame that had gone crooked, and then her footsteps carried on toward the laundry room. Alaya opened the note in her lap below the edge of the table and read it without moving her face at all, a skill I suspect she had been practicing longer than I realized. Watch her, say nothing. She looked up at me and gave the smallest nod I have ever seen a person give. We finished 2 more fake problems before Denise disappeared toward the back of the house, and the moment the hallway was clear, I told Alaya quietly that I needed her to do something harder than watching. I needed her to learn to watch the way I used to watch a street. 38 years delivering mail teaches you things nobody thinks to write down in any manual. It teaches you that a house with 3 days of newspapers piling up on the porch has trouble inside it. It teaches you that a person who suddenly starts locking a door they never used to lock is hiding something behind it, even when the something is small. It teaches you that people lie easily with their words and almost never with their habits, because habits take too much energy to fake convincingly for very long. I told her, too, to notice the small things that never quite line up between what a person says and what their body does while they say it. The way a person's hands go still when they are telling the truth, and busy themselves with something small when they are not. I told her to notice when her mother left the house and how long she stayed gone. I told her to notice which rooms Kylie kept the doors closed on now that had always stood open before. I told her to notice who called the house phone and hung up without leaving a message, and whether her mother ever seemed surprised by a call she should not have been expecting at all. I told her about Mr. Ellery Baptiste, 3 streets over, whose mail I had delivered for 20 years before he passed. One July, his box went 3 whole days without being emptied, which was not like him at all. And when I mentioned it to his daughter at the end of my route, she drove by that same evening and found him on his kitchen floor, alive but unable to reach the phone after a fall 2 days earlier. Nobody else on that street had noticed a single thing was wrong. I noticed because I had trained myself to pay attention to patterns most people walk right past without ever seeing. Alaya listened the way she used to listen to Odessa's old stories out on the porch swing, completely still taking in every word like she meant to keep it forever. I told her about the phone call I had overheard through the wall, The 4 words that had followed me around all week. He still doesn't know. She frowned, turning the phrase over the way I had been turning it over myself for days. She asked me who I thought the he in that sentence might be. I told her I did not know yet, only that it worried me more than almost anything else that had happened since that Sunday morning outside Odell's house. She was quiet for a long moment, picking at the edge of her textbook page, and then she finally asked me the question I had been waiting for her to ask since the night she first told me about the man in the parking lot. "Do you think Mom is behind all of this, Grandpa?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not Dad, her." I looked at this girl I had known since the day she was born, 17 years old, and already carrying more weight than any child should have to carry inside a house that was supposed to be safe for her above every other place on earth. I told her I did not have the whole truth of it yet, and neither did she, and that was exactly why she needed to keep watching and keep listening, instead of deciding the answer ahead of the evidence. "Watch and listen," I told her. "Do not rush to trust anyone completely right now. Not your father, not your mother." She looked at me, waiting the unspoken end of that sentence, hanging heavy in the air between us. "Not even me," I said. "Not until you have seen enough with your own eyes to know for certain which one of us is telling you the truth." A car I had never seen before pulled into my driveway a few mornings after that conversation with Elia, black and freshly washed, with a driver in a gray suit who came around to open the back door before I had even finished my coffee. Kylie met me in the kitchen with a suitcase already packed and waiting by the front door. My suitcase filled with clothes I did not remember choosing, and a few books I would not have picked out for myself. She told me in the same warm voice she always used right before she was about to take something from me, that the house needed some serious foundation work down in the crawl space. Work that would kick up dust and mold spores no man my age should be breathing for weeks at a time, and that she had found a lovely place nearby where I could stay comfortably until it was finished. I asked her how long the work would take. She said she was not entirely sure yet, maybe a few weeks, maybe longer, depending on what the contractors found once they got underneath the house. I did not believe one word of it. I had inspected that crawl space myself not 4 months earlier, and found nothing worse than a little settling any house that age would show. But I also understood, standing in my own kitchen, holding a suitcase I had not packed, that arguing the point would only prove to whatever judge read about it later that I was exactly the difficult, confused old man they needed me to be. So I nodded. I thanked her for thinking of my comfort, and I asked only for a moment alone to say goodbye to my own house properly before I climbed into a stranger's car. She let me have that much at least. I walked slowly through rooms I had walked through thousands of times without ever once really looking at them the way I looked at them that morning. I ran my hand along the door frame in the kitchen where I had marked Dante's height every year until he turned 13 and declared himself too old for it. I stood a long moment in the bedroom Odessa and I had shared for 40 years, breathing in whatever was left of her that still lived in that air after 6 years without her. I touched the front doorknob I had installed myself, the same one my hand had rested on the morning I found out what my family had done. And I understood with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in my chest that I might not be walking back through this particular door again for a very long time, if ever. I walked out back for a moment too, just long enough to look at the garden Odessa had kept blooming even through her last difficult year. The azaleas she had insisted on planting along the back fence because she always said a house without flowers was nothing more than a box people happened to sleep in. Somebody had let the beds go a little wild since I lost the patience to kneel in the dirt myself, but the azaleas were still there, still hers, still blooming red against the fence exactly the way she had planned for them to. Dante stood by the stairs while I made my slow circuit of the house, watching me with an expression I could not fully read, something caught between guilt and grief. But he said nothing at all, and he did not once meet my eyes long enough for either of us to have to acknowledge what was actually happening between us. The drive to Magnolia Terrace took 25 minutes, most of it in silence. And when the car finally turned into a long circular driveway lined with crepe myrtles in full bloom, I understood immediately why Kylie had chosen this particular place to show me first. It looked less like a facility and more like a hotel built for people who wanted to forget they were dying somewhere expensive. Marble floors. Fresh flowers arranged on a grand piano nobody was playing. A woman at the front desk who greeted Kylie by name, like the two of them had done this particular dance together before, more than once. Somewhere down a side hallway, out of sight, but not quite out of earshot, I heard a thin, papery voice calling out for someone named Harold over and over, patient and unanswered, and nobody at that beautiful front desk so much as glanced up from their computer screen. They walked me to a room on the second floor, sunlit, tastefully furnished, smelling faintly of lavender, instead of the bleach and boiled cabbage I might have expected walking into a place like this. Kylie kissed my cheek, told me she would visit soon, and left with Dante trailing behind her like a man walking slowly toward his own sentencing. A staff member whose name I did not catch showed me where the call button was, where the bathroom was, told me dinner would be served promptly at 5, and then stepped back out into the hallway, pulling the door shut gently behind her. I heard the lock engage automatically a second later. A soft, official click that no ordinary bedroom door back on Willow Bend Street had ever made in 38 years of my walking through it freely, whenever I pleased, as a man who owned every room he ever slept in. I sat down slowly on the edge of an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar room, surrounded by furniture chosen by strangers to resemble comfort, and understood for the first time exactly how far they intended to take this. Outside my window, past a courtyard fountain that ran even though nobody sat near it to hear it, I could just make out the tops of the pine trees lining the highway that led back toward Carver Heights, back toward Willow Bend Street, back toward a house that did not need a single day of foundation work and never once had. Alea told me everything about that night after it happened, in pieces at first, and then all at once. She waited 3 days before she told me, turning it over in her own mind first, she said later, because some part of her still hoped she had misunderstood what she heard. She had not. Even now, telling it back, I find I can still hear the exact shape of her mother's voice through a closed door, the way a person can still feel a burn on their hand long after the stove has gone cold. That evening, with me settled 2 towns away, behind a door with an automatic lock, Alea slipped the little second-hand phone I had given her into the pocket of her hoodie, pressed record the way I had shown her, and walked down the hallway toward her parents' bedroom on the pretense of asking her mother where the good scissors were kept. She never had to ask the question. Kylie's door stood open a few inches, and through the gap, Alea could see her mother pacing beside the bedphone pressed to her ear. Her voice pitched low and fast, in a register Alea said she had never once heard her mother use in front of anyone in this family. Alea stood very still in the hallway, one hand against the wall, and listened. Kylie was talking to Judson Woodward. That much was clear from the first few words. There's still the matter of the title search on the 4th property, Kylie said. Her voice, all business, precise and unhurried. My understanding is these things can occasionally get delayed if there is any question at all about competency at the time of transfer. So I need you telling me the moment your legal team has anything solid we can move on. We are already behind where I told you we would be by now. Then the conversation shifted, the way conversations do when 2 people have already settled the business part and are only reassuring each other about the details that keep them up at night. He's not going to be a problem, Kylie said. And there was something almost bored in the way she said it. The particular boredom of a woman explaining something for the 3rd or 4th time. He's harmless, Judson, sweet, even in a sad sort of way. He genuinely believes charging people half of market rent on those houses makes him some kind of saint. It would almost be touching if it were not so exhausting to watch. There was a pause while Woodward said something on the other end Alea could not hear. Sentiment, Kylie said, and laughed a short, sharp sound with no warmth left in it at all. That is exactly the problem with that whole street, if you want my honest opinion. All of them sitting in those little houses like it is some kind of monument, instead of just real estate that happens to be worth 4 times what it was 10 years ago. People like him confuse paying off a mortgage with actually understanding money. He has been playing landlord to a bunch of old folks for 20 years and thinks that makes him some kind of businessman. It does not, Judson. It makes him a very tired old man who worked his whole life and still cannot tell the difference between owning something and just being sentimentally attached to it. Alea said she felt her whole body go cold standing in that hallway, colder than she had ever felt in her life, because this was not the voice of a woman worried about her father-in-law's safety. This was the voice of somebody counting down days on a calendar. She told me her hands were shaking so badly by that point that she had to press the phone flat against her own thigh just to keep the recording steady, afraid the smallest rustle of fabric might give her away before she had captured enough to matter. Kylie kept talking, pacing faster now, saying something about Dante being useful, right up until the paperwork cleared, and then becoming, in her words, somebody else's problem to manage. She said the word family the way a person might say the name of a competitor's product, something to be tolerated rather than believed in. And then, near the very end of the call, her voice dropped lower still, and Elia had to lean closer to the door just to catch it at all. The old man built his whole identity around being the good one, Kylie said, the responsible one. It is honestly kind of pathetic watching someone that age still trying to prove something to a neighborhood that has already moved past him. Anyway, just make sure the paperwork is airtight on our end. I do not need him understanding a single word of what is happening to him until it is already done. The call ended abruptly. Elia heard the small electronic beep of the line disconnecting, and half a second later, the bed springs creaking as Kylie turned sharply toward the door. Elia did not remember deciding to move. She simply found herself already moving, phone still recording inside her pocket, slipping soundlessly across the hall and into the bathroom, just as her mother's footsteps reached the doorway behind her. She eased the bathroom door shut without a click, turned on the tap to cover the sound of her own breathing, and stood there in the noise of the running water with her back against the wall, and my little second-hand phone still glowing faintly through the fabric of her pocket, still recording, still keeping every single word that had just been spoken on the other side of that door. She stayed in that bathroom a full 5 minutes before she trusted her own legs to carry her back to her room. And even then, she told me she slept that night with the phone tucked beneath her pillow, one hand resting on top of it, the way a much younger child might sleep holding on to something that made the dark feel a little less dangerous. Elia drove herself to Magnolia Terrace the next afternoon, something she was not technically supposed to do alone on the highway. Yet, and I did not have the heart to scold her for it once I saw her face. She looked like she had not slept, which she had not, and she did not say much of anything before she pulled a set of small white earbuds from her pocket and handed me one, keeping the other for herself. Her hand trembling so badly, I had to steady it with my own before she could get the little device connected properly. My room at Magnolia Terrace faced east, and the afternoon light coming through those tall windows was the kind of soft, forgiving gold that decorators probably chose on purpose. The sort of light meant to make everyone inside it look a little more at peace than they actually were. It felt like exactly the wrong light for what we were about to do. I will not repeat here everything I heard in those few minutes. Some of it I have already told you. Some of it I do not think I will ever tell anyone in full. Not even on a night like this one, because a man is allowed to keep at least a few wounds entirely to himself. What I will tell you is what it felt like sitting in a borrowed chair in a rented room, listening to my son's wife describe me in my own granddaughter's ear as something closer to an obstacle than a person. There is a particular loneliness in hearing yourself reduced to a line item by someone who has eaten at your table more times than you could ever count. Someone whose hand you have held at Christmas dinners and hospital waiting rooms alike. And I do not know that I have fully recovered from it even now, though I have had a long while since to try. I did not cry. I did not shout. I sat very still with my hands folded in my lap, the way I used to sit through difficult sermons as a boy. And I let every word land exactly where it was aimed, because I had already decided, long before that recording ever reached my ears, that whatever this cost me, I intended to remain the only person in this story who never once lost control of himself. When it finished, Elia pulled the earbud from her own ear and looked at me, waiting, her whole body coiled like a spring that had been wound too tight for far too long. "Well," she said when I did not speak right away, "now we tell Dad. Now he has to believe us." I told her, no, not yet. She stared at me like I had slapped her, which in a sense I suppose I had, and she wanted to know how I could possibly sit there, having just heard what we had both heard, and choose to protect the very people who had put me in this room in the first place. "I am not protecting them," I told her. I am protecting your father from the easiest lie he will ever get the chance to tell himself." She did not understand, and I did not blame her for it, because it took me 76 years and a great many mistakes of my own to understand it fully myself. "If we hand your father this recording today," I said, "he will spend the rest of his life believing his wife did this to him. Only his wife, nobody else. He will cry and he will rage, and eventually, he will forgive himself completely, because in his mind, he will always have been the one who was deceived, rather than the one who chose over and over to look away from what he already suspected." I have watched that boy avoid the weight of his own choices his entire life, Elia. And some real part of that is my own fault, because I made it too easy for him too many times when he was young, and it was still my job to make it hard. I thought of the time he wrecked his mother's car at 17, and I had it repaired before Odessa ever learned there had been an accident at all. I thought of the 3 or 4 times over the years I quietly settled some debt he never knew I knew about, just to keep the peace, just to spare him one uncomfortable evening sitting alone with the weight of his own mistakes. She asked me quietly now what I thought would actually be different if he found out on his own instead. "If Dante discovers the truth for himself," I told her, "in his own time, through his own eyes, he cannot hand the blame to anyone else afterward. He will have to stand in it alone. That is the only door I know of that leads anywhere close to a man actually becoming better than he has been." Alea was quiet for a long while after that, turning the little phone over and over in her hands. And when she finally spoke again, her voice had lost some of its fight and gained something heavier in its place. "So we just wait," she said. "We sit on this, and we let him keep believing whatever he wants to believe about his own marriage, and we wait." I reached over and took her hand, the one still holding that small, dangerous phone, and held it steady between both of mine. "Not forever," I told her, "just until the moment does the work for us instead of us doing it for him." She looked down at our hands together, then back up at me, her eyes bright and unconvinced. "And how long is that supposed to take, Grandpa?" she asked. "How long do we wait?" "Until it is the right time," I told her. I noticed Matteo Tran on my 4th day at Magnolia Terrace, though it took me another 2 before I worked up a proper reason to speak to him directly. I was sitting in the common room that afternoon, pretending to read a magazine nobody had bothered updating since spring, when I watched an elderly woman 2 chairs down from me, a small, bird-like woman named Mrs. Okonkwo, who mostly kept to herself, struggle to lift a water pitcher with hands that clearly did not want to cooperate with her that day. The head nurse, a tall woman named Patricia, who moved through that building like she was perpetually late for somewhere more important, walked right past Mrs. Okonkwo without so much as a glance in her direction, her eyes fixed on whatever clipboard she was carrying. It was Matteo who noticed. He was younger than I had first taken him for, maybe 23 or 24, with the kind of tired eyes I recognized from 38 years of working double shifts myself. He set down the cart of towels he had been pushing, crossed the room without being asked, and poured the water himself, kneeling slightly so he was at eye level with her while he did it, asking her something quiet enough that I could not make out the words, but could read easily enough in the way Mrs. Okonkwo's whole face softened while he spoke to her. She said something back to him I could not hear either, and he laughed a real laugh, not the practiced kind service workers learn to perform for difficult customers, and for just a moment, the whole room felt a little less like a waiting room for the end of something. Nobody had told him to do that. Nobody was watching to see whether he did it or not, except me. I decided that day that whatever Matteo Tran was being paid for that job, it was not enough. And whatever had brought a young man with that particular gentleness into a building full of people, the rest of the world had mostly stopped paying close attention to, it was worth my finding out. It took 2 more days before I got a real chance to speak with him alone. He came by my room one evening to check the water pitcher on my own nightstand, and I asked him plainly how long he had been working there. He told me 1.5 years, going to school part-time in the mornings for a nursing degree, he was paying for 1 exhausting semester at a time, working the Magnolia Terrace shift most afternoons and evenings to cover the difference between his financial aid and his actual bills. His mother had worked in a nursing home herself back when he was a boy, he told me. cleaning rooms on the night shift for 20 years in a building not so different from this one. And he said he used to fall asleep some nights on a cot in the staff break room, waiting for her shift to end, listening to residents down the hall call out for people who were not coming. He said it all without complaint, the way a person says something so ordinary to their own life that it does not occur to them it might sound remarkable to somebody else hearing it for the first time. I told him a little about myself in return, though not everything, not yet. I told him I had been a mail carrier for 38 years on the east side of the city, that I had raised a son I still loved, even though loving him had gotten considerably more complicated lately, and that I was fairly certain the people who had brought me to this particular room believed I would be easier to manage here than I actually intended to be. There was something in hearing his story that felt oddly like looking into a mirror turned sideways. I had spent 38 years in a job most people only noticed when it went wrong, delivering something that mattered to somebody at the other end of every single stop, mostly invisible to the people I served, except in the smallest, most unconsidered ways. Mateo was doing that same kind of work now, only harder, only for people running out of time, instead of simply waiting on the next day's mail. Mateo did not ask me to explain any further, which I respected. He simply nodded the way a person nods when they have heard enough of these stories in enough of these rooms to recognize the shape of one even without every detail filled in for them. "You seem sharper than most of the folks on this floor, Mr. Pugh," he said, setting the pitcher back down on the nightstand. "No offense meant to anybody else here." "None taken," I told him. "I have been working very hard to make sure it stays that way in this building, and I would consider it a personal favor if that particular fact stayed between the two of us for now." He looked at me a moment longer than the comment probably required, something calculating and careful passing behind his tired eyes, and then he said, quiet as anything, that he understood a great deal more than people usually gave him credit for around here. I sat with that answer for a moment, turning it over the way I used to turn over an envelope that felt heavier in my hand than it had any business being. Then I decided right there on a Thursday evening, watching a young man who worked himself half to death for people the world had mostly stopped looking at closely, that Mateo Tran was exactly the kind of person I needed on my side before this was over. I opened my mouth to ask him for the one thing I actually needed. I closed my door as much as the facility rules allowed, which was not fully, and lowered my voice to something just above a whisper. I had turned this request over in my mind more times than I could count since that Thursday evening, weighing what I was about to ask against what it might cost a young man who had already given me more kindness than he owed a stranger in a rented room. "I need to borrow your phone," I told him, "just for 1 minute, just to send one message to my lawyer, and then you can take it right back, and I promise you will never see me ask for anything like this again." Mateo went very still. His eyes flicked almost involuntarily toward the small black dome mounted in the corner of the hallway ceiling, just visible through my open door. The camera that watched everyone who came and went from this wing of the building. Though I doubted very much it could hear a single word either of us said. "I could lose my job for this," he said quiet, more thinking out loud than actually refusing. He told me residents were not supposed to have any unsupervised contact with staff. Phones, not for privacy reasons so much as liability ones, and that a single complaint from the wrong family member could end not just this job, but the reference letter he needed for the nursing program he was still 2 long semesters from finishing. I told him I understood that, and that I would never ask if I had any other way to reach the man who was the only thing standing between me and losing everything I had spent my whole life building. I told him this was not paranoia talking. I told him a court date was coming sooner than anybody in my family wanted me prepared for, and that if the wrong people got to that hearing before the right paperwork did, an old woman named Odell Fairweather and half a dozen other people on my old mail route were going to lose their homes right along with me. Mateo did not say anything for a long moment. He looked past me out the window toward the parking lot, and I wondered if he was thinking about his mother working nights in a building not unlike this one, watching things happen to people that nobody with the power to stop it ever seemed to notice in time. "One text," he said finally. "That is all I am giving you, Mr. Pugh. 1. And then this phone goes right back in my pocket, and we never speak of it again unless you bring it up first." He handed it over before I could thank him properly, glancing once more toward that little black dome in the ceiling, and stepped half a pace to the side so his own body blocked the doorway from anyone who might happen to glance in from the hall. My hands are not as fast on a screen like that as they used to be on a keyboard, and it took me longer than it should have to find the messaging application and type out Thomas Whitaker's number, which I had made myself memorize the same week I gave Aliyah her own little phone, understanding even then that a day might come when I would not have a phone of my own to rely on. I typed slowly, checking each word twice because I only had the one chance to get this exactly right. I thought for just a moment about all the other words I could have chosen instead, softer words, words that might have explained more and frightened Mateo less about what he was actually helping me do. But softer words were a luxury I had given up the right to the day Kylie slid that folder across my own coffee table. And there was no time left now for anything except exactly what needed saying. Activate the protection clause. Carver Heights. I did not explain further. Whitaker did not need me to. 8 years earlier, sitting across a conference table from a man who had asked me exactly one careful question before agreeing to help me build something most people would have called excessive caution for a man in perfectly good health, I had told him that if this particular message ever reached him from any number at any hour of the day or night, he was to move immediately and ask his questions afterward. I pressed send, watched the small indicator confirm delivery, and handed the phone back to Mateo with hands that were for the first time in weeks almost entirely steady. He slid it into his pocket without looking at the screen, nodded once, short and businesslike, and pushed his cart of towels back out into the hallway as though nothing at all had happened in that room a moment before. I sat alone afterward in the sudden quiet, staring at the space where the phone's small glowing screen had been a moment before, now dark, now nothing at all, and understood that somewhere across the city, a very careful man was reading 11 words that would begin the end of everything Kylie and Judson Woodward believed they had already won. I said a quiet prayer for Mateo Tran that night, the kind Odessa used to say for people whose names she barely knew, but whose kindness had crossed her path all the same. Because whatever came next for my family, I understood clearly that I had just asked a young man already carrying a great deal of weight of his own to carry a little more of mine too. And he had said yes anyway, for reasons that had nothing at all to do with what I could ever pay him back. Dante told me all of this later in far more detail than I ever wanted to know, but I include it here because a man cannot understand how his own son came to betray him without first understanding exactly what that son was thinking in the hour before he ever picked up the pen. He was alone in the small office he kept off the garage, the one he had converted himself, out of pride. The year he thought his house-flipping business was finally going to make something of itself. Sitting in the dark, because he said the dark somehow made the numbers on his laptop screen easier to look at directly. $230,000. That was the figure staring back at him that night, the sum total of a renovation loan gone bad on a property in Bronxville he had bought 2 years earlier, convinced he could flip it in 4 months for a clean profit. Only to discover, after the drywall was already up, and the buyers already lined up, that the foundation beneath it had been quietly failing since before he ever signed the closing papers. The lawsuits alone had eaten through most of what he had left. The interest on what remained grew a little larger every single week. A slow, patient animal, he said he could hear breathing even when he was not looking directly at it. He had not told me any of this when it was actually happening. Not the loan, not the lawsuit, not the collection calls that had started arriving at odd hours from numbers he no longer recognized. He told me later that pride had kept him quiet far longer than sense should have allowed. The same particular pride that had once made him certain at 22 years old that he could succeed faster and bigger than his own father ever had, delivering nothing more than mail for 38 patient, unremarkable years. Kylie found him there sometime after midnight, still in her work clothes from whatever meeting had kept her out so late that evening. Though Dante told me now, looking back on it, that he had never once actually confirmed where those late meetings truly took place. She did not raise her voice. She never needed to. She sat down across from him, slid a manila folder across the desk, and told him gently, the way a person might explain something painful to a child, that there was still one way out of this that did not involve losing everything, They had spent their whole marriage building together. "Your father's 4 houses on Willow Bend," she said, practically giving them away in rent to people who will never once properly thank him for it. Sitting there, worth a small fortune on paper, while we drown in real debt underneath it. He would help if we simply asked him directly, but you know how he is about that street. He will find some reason to say no, the same way he finds a reason to say no to everything that might actually move us forward as a family. Dante told me he sat with that folder unopened for a long while, staring instead at a photograph on his desk of the 2 of us on the day he graduated high school. My hand heavy and proud on his shoulder, both of us grinning like a couple of fools who believed the hardest years were already safely behind them. He remembered he told me standing in the driveway the summer I taught him to parallel park patient in a way he said I was rarely patient about anything else. Telling him that a man's whole life gets built, one careful decision at a time, and that the quickest road between 2 points is almost never the one actually worth taking. In the end, he could still remember the exact smell of the vinyl seats in my old truck that summer, and the particular steadiness in my voice even on the 4th or 5th failed attempt, back when most fathers he knew would have already started raising their voices. He thought about calling me directly that night, he said, just to hear my voice, just to ask me one more time plainly whether I would help him the honest way, if he simply asked. He decided against it. He told me later that he already knew, somewhere underneath all the fear and all the shame, exactly what my answer was going to be. And some smaller, more desperate part of him had already stopped wanting to hear it out loud. Kylie reached over and opened the folder herself when he did not, smoothing the top page flat with one hand, turning it slowly so the signature line faced him directly. "It is just a formality, Dante," she told him softly. "He will barely even notice, and once the loan clears, we can explain everything to him properly on our own terms, once he is calmer and more reasonable about the whole situation than he has been lately." She reached across the desk and covered his free hand with her own, her thumb tracing small, soothing circles against his knuckles, the way she used to in the early years of their marriage. Back when Dante still believed every gesture she made toward him was purely about love and nothing else underneath it. "I am not asking you to hurt him," she said quietly. "I am asking you to save us." Dante picked up the pen from the cup on his desk. The same pen, he told me later, was something close to shame, thick in his voice, that I had given him for his college graduation, engraved with his own initials in small, careful letters. He had once been so proud to carry around in his shirt pocket. His hand was shaking so badly that the pen tip hovered a full inch above the paper for a long moment before it ever finally touched down. He set the pen down once just to breathe, and picked it back up again a second time before he let himself think too hard about it. He practiced first on a blank scrap of paper beside the real document, 3 attempts, then 4, trying to recall the particular slant of my handwriting from decades of watching me sign birthday cards and permission slips and the backs of 1,000 ordinary checks. He had an old birthday card of mine still tucked away in his wallet, he told me. One I had given him years earlier with nothing more than my signature and a short note scrawled inside. And he propped it open against his laptop screen that night, studying it the way a forger studies a masterpiece, memorizing the particular weight I put on the P in Pew, the small hitch where the pen always paused half a second before the final G. He got close on the 4th try, close enough that even I, looking at it much later in a courtroom exhibit binder, felt a strange, cold jolt of recognition, seeing my own name written out in a hand that was not mine at all. There is a small flourish I have made at the end of every capital B I have written since I was a boy, a little upward curl. My own father taught me decades before that, back when penmanship still mattered to men who worked with their hands all day and wanted their names to look like something worth reading afterward. Dante remembered that flourish. He told me later it was the one detail he felt proudest of getting exactly right, and the very detail in the end that helped undo him completely. He picked up the real document at last, steadied his hand hard against the edge of the desk, and signed my full name across the transfer line for all 4 houses on Willow Bend, slow and careful, the pen barely lifting between letters, the way mine never actually does. The office door was cracked open, perhaps 2 inches, just enough for a thin blade of yellow light to fall across the dark grass outside. And it was that narrow, deliberate light, more than the voices themselves, that first pulled Aliyah out of her own bed that night. Outside in the dark of the side yard, Aliyah stood pressed against the cool brick wall of the garage, having woken from a restless sleep to the low murmur of voices where no voices should have been at that hour, and having followed that murmur out through the kitchen door in her bare feet without entirely deciding to. The concrete of the side yard was cold enough in the dark to make her wince with every step, and somewhere down the block a dog was barking at nothing at all. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary night, pressing in strange and unwelcome against what she already half suspected she was about to walk into. She told me she almost turned back twice. The third time she nearly did. She thought instead of the little plastic phone hidden beneath her mattress of the two words, "Watch her," that had started all of this weeks earlier, and something in her chest steadied itself just enough to keep her feet moving toward that lit window instead of carrying her away from it. She reached the window in time to see her father lift the pen from the page and exhale long and shaking, the way a person exhales after finally doing something they have spent hours convincing themselves they could learn to live with afterward. Aliyah lifted her own phone with hands nearly as unsteady as her father's had just been, angled it carefully through the gap in the blinds, and began to record. She caught the document itself, my name, written wrong in a hand pretending very hard to be right. She caught Kylie's face over Dante's shoulder, satisfied in a way that had nothing warm left in it at all. She caught Kylie's voice, too low and pleased, saying only 3 words as she slid the paper toward herself. There, all done. As though her husband had just finished some minor household chore, rather than committed a quiet, careful felony against his own father. She caught 11 full seconds of her father sitting perfectly still afterward, staring down at what his own hand had just finished doing, before Kylie reached over and tucked the paper away into a folder marked with Judson Woodward's company letterhead. Kylie glanced toward the window, then, just once, just briefly, her eyes narrowing slightly at the darkness beyond the glass. And Aliyah's whole body went cold from the inside out. She did not wait to see whether her mother had actually seen anything at all. She lowered the phone, backed away from the glow of that window, one silent step at a time, and did not stop moving until she was back inside her own dark bedroom, with the door shut and locked behind her. Her heart slamming so hard against her ribs that she could hear it over her own breathing. She did not cry, not yet. She told me crying came almost a full hour later, quiet and controlled, into her pillow, so neither of her parents would hear it through the thin bedroom walls, and that what finally broke her composure was not the fear of being caught at all, but the small, sick certainty that whatever her father had just done to his own father, some version of it had probably been building quietly inside their house for a very long time before that particular night ever arrived to make it real. A woman named Priscilla Odom, a records clerk at the Harris County Land Office, who I have still never met to this day, was the first person in the entire world to notice that something was wrong with the paperwork that crossed her desk that Tuesday morning. She told Whitaker later, and Whitaker told me, that the system flagged the transfer the moment she entered the parcel numbers. A hard stop she said she had seen only a handful of times in 11 years at that job. The kind reserved for properties held under very particular kinds of legal protection. She called her supervisor over. Her supervisor made a phone call of his own. Within the hour, the whole file had been forwarded to a fraud review desk that did not usually see this much attention on a Tuesday. I learned all of this in far greater detail a few hours later when Thomas Whitaker walked into my room at Magnolia Terrace without calling ahead first, something he had never once done in all our years working together, carrying a leather folder of his own, and an expression I had not seen on his face since the week we buried Odessa. 8 years ago, Whitaker reminded me, though I hardly needed reminding, the two of us and Quentin sat in my old dining room and built something most people back then would have called excessive caution for a healthy man in his late 60s. We placed all 4 of your Willow Bend properties into an irrevocable community land trust, with Quentin and Pastor Emmanuel Ross over at Mount Zion serving as independent co-trustees alongside you. The trust bylaws include one very specific clause. If you are ever declared mentally incompetent or incapacitated by any court, control of the trust does not pass to any family member automatically. It transfers immediately and irrevocably to the independent co-trustees named in the document. He told me that the moment Dante and Kylie filed their guardianship petition, claiming I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, they had unknowingly triggered that exact clause. The trust had locked itself that very same afternoon. Every document, every transfer, every signature attempted on any of those 4 properties from that day forward was automatically flagged for county review, whether anyone in my family understood that or not. Which means, Whitaker said that when your son walked a forged quitclaim deed into that county office yesterday morning, he was not simply committing forgery. He was attempting to transfer property that had legally stopped being his to touch weeks earlier, the very moment he tried to prove to a judge that I could not be trusted with it myself. I sat with that for a long moment, turning the shape of it over in my mind, the way I once turned over an envelope that felt heavier than it should. They had built their entire case on my incompetence. My own incompetence on paper, in their own words, was the very thing that had slammed the door shut in their faces. I thought of Quentin's voice on that midnight phone call weeks earlier, asking me plainly if I was certain, warning me that once we pulled this particular trigger, there would be no quiet way to ever undo it. I thought of sitting across that same dining room table from Whitaker 8 years before, Odessa's own health already failing in the next room, both of us so afraid of exactly this kind of morning arriving one day, that we had built a wall neither of us ever truly believed we would live to see me actually need. Whitaker told me the county was already coordinating with the district attorney's office. The biometric handwriting comparison alone, run against a dozen documents I had genuinely signed over the decades, would take investigators perhaps a day to confirm what we both already knew. Forgery. Attempted transfer of trust property under false pretenses. Potentially, depending on how deep anyone chose to look, conspiracy. Dante learned all of this roughly an hour before I did, from his own family law attorney, a nervous young man named Colby Reyes, who Kylie had hired months earlier, and who Dante told me later sounded more frightened on that phone call than Dante had ever heard a grown man sound in his life. Mr. Pugh Reyes had said, his voice tight and clipped, "You need to understand, this is not a paperwork error we can quietly fix. The properties were locked under an existing trust instrument at the time of the attempted transfer. Whoever signed that document may be looking at felony forgery charges. I need you to tell me plainly, right now, on this phone, whether that signature was actually yours." Dante told me he sat in absolute silence for what felt like a full minute before he finally answered, and that the silence itself was answer enough for Reyes to understand exactly what had happened in that garage office 2 nights earlier. He hung up the phone with hands that would not stop shaking and went looking for Kylie, moving through the house room by room, the way a man moves through a house he is only now realizing he never actually knew. Her closet was half empty. A rolling suitcase that usually lived in the garage was gone from its spot. Her passport, which Dante had once teased her for keeping in a fireproof lockbox under their bed like they were international spies, was gone along with it. The little box left open and hollow on the closet floor. She was not answering her phone. She was not answering his texts, which grew shorter and more desperate with each one he sent, until the messages simply stopped delivering at all sometime around noon. Her number apparently blocked from his entirely. Dante stood alone in the middle of that half-empty closet for a long while, he told me, holding an empty, fireproof box in his 2 hands, finally beginning to understand 1 full day too late precisely what kind of woman he had built his entire unraveling around. I was not in that hotel room, and neither Kylie nor Judson Woodward ever sat down afterward to explain to me exactly how that conversation went. But enough of it surfaced later in phone records and sworn testimony, and the particular details people let slip when they are trying to save themselves in front of a judge, that I can put the shape of it together well enough now to tell you. She had checked into a room at an airport hotel sometime around noon, paying in cash under a name that was not quite her own, though not different enough it would turn out later to fool anyone seriously looking. The room was the kind every airport hotel keeps in exact identical supply, beige and forgettable, chosen specifically because nobody who checks into a room like that ever wants to be remembered checking in. She had already changed clothes twice, she later admitted under oath. Trying and failing to settle on something that felt appropriate for a conversation she had never once, in all her careful planning, actually rehearsed. She sat on the edge of a bed that smelled faintly of industrial detergent, her passport and a folder of documents spread across the comforter in front of her, and called Judson Woodward's private cell phone number 4 times before he finally picked up on the 5th. "Judson," she said, and her voice, by every account I have since heard, had lost every trace of the warm practice calm she used on the rest of us. "We have a problem, a real one. The trust locked the properties before Dante's paperwork ever went through, and now there is a fraud investigation with my name floating somewhere close to the edges of it. Close enough that I need you to make some things disappear before anyone starts pulling threads that lead back to either one of us." There was a long pause on the line, long enough, she told her own attorney weeks later under oath, that she genuinely believed for a moment the call had simply dropped. She pulled the phone away from her ear once, just to check the screen, confirming the call was still connected, her thumb hovering over the end button before some last flicker of hope talked her out of hanging up first. "We are partners in this, Judson," she said, when his silence stretched on too long for her comfort. "You told me yourself we were building something together." "We were building a real estate transaction," Kylie Woodward said. "That is all we were ever building. I believe you may have confused a working relationship for something considerably more sentimental than it ever actually was. And I would gently suggest that particular confusion is exactly the kind of thing that gets people convicted. I do not know what you think I can do about a county fraud investigation." He continued, his voice even and unhurried, in a way that should have frightened her more than it apparently did at the time. "My name is not on any transfer document. My name is not on any forged signature. My involvement, as far as any record shows, was a single unsolicited letter of interest my firm sends out to dozens of property owners every quarter, as standard business practice." She reminded him, sharper now, of the phone calls, of the meetings in that parking lot off Alameda Road, of the timeline he had personally pushed her to accelerate more than once, whenever his own investors grew impatient, waiting on the deal to finally close. "I remember a business relationship," Kylie Woodward said. "I do not remember anything that would survive a subpoena, and I would strongly advise you to start thinking the same way before you say another single word on an unsecured line." She asked him, her voice cracking now for the first time since she had picked up that phone, whether he simply intended to let her fall while he walked away clean. "I intend," he said, "to protect Woodward Development Group the same way I have protected it for 20 years. The same way I protected it through 3 lawsuits and 1 very ugly business divorce that nobody outside a small circle of lawyers ever heard a single word about. You are welcome to call my office in the morning if you would like to discuss this further through the appropriate legal channels." Kylie told her attorney later that she called his name once more, sharp and desperate, before she even realized the line had already gone dead in her own hand. Woodward, for his part, according to phone records entered later into evidence, hung up that call and immediately dialed his own general counsel, a conversation that lasted 11 minutes, and by every indication anyone was ever able to uncover afterward, ended with every trace of correspondence between his office and Kylie Pugh being quietly, thoroughly, and quite legally scrubbed from every server his company controlled. It was, Whitaker told me afterward with something almost like professional admiration in his voice, one of the cleanest acts of corporate self-preservation he had personally witnessed in 30 years of practicing law. I think about that phone call sometimes, the two of them speaking to each other in the exact same cold transactional language Kylie had once used to describe me to a man she believed could not hear her, only now turned back on her by someone even better practiced at that particular language than she ever was. There is a certain kind of justice in that, I have come to believe, though it took me a good while to recognize it as anything other than one more ugly thing this whole ordeal had cost all of us. Alea called me that night a few minutes past 9 o'clock, and I could hear before she said a single word that whatever had happened in that house, was the thing we had both been waiting on for weeks. I was sitting in my own room at Magnolia Terrace when the phone rang, an old paperback open and forgotten in my lap, and something in the particular rhythm of her breathing on the other end of the line told me to set the book aside entirely before she even managed her first full sentence. She told me she found her father sitting alone in the dark kitchen, still in yesterday's clothes, staring at nothing in particular. A man who looked, she said, like he had aged 5 years in the space of one single afternoon. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee. Neither of them had bothered drinking that morning, and the only light in the whole room came from the small yellow bulb above the stove. The same bulb that had been flickering and threatening to die for the better part of a year. He did not ask about her mother. He did not ask where she had been all day. He simply sat there, and Elia told me she stood in the doorway a long moment, weighing everything I had once told her about waiting for the right time, before she finally decided that whatever right time actually meant, this broken, hollowed-out version of her father, sitting alone in that kitchen, was as close to it as she was ever likely to get. She sat down across from him without a word, set the little phone on the table between them, and pressed play. I will not repeat here everything that recording said. You have already heard the worst of it, same as I did. What I can tell you is what Elia told me about her father's face while he listened, because she watched every second of it, unwilling to look away, even when some part of her clearly wanted to. She said his expression did not break all at once. It went first through something like confusion, as though his mind simply refused the information for the first 10 or 15 seconds. Then something colder settled over him, a kind of stillness Elia said she had never once seen on her father in her entire life, not even during the worst of the arguments over money that had rattled that house all summer long. It was, she said, the same stillness she imagined a man might wear after a doctor delivers news. There is no gentle way to deliver the particular quiet of somebody doing careful, silent arithmetic with the whole of his own life. He heard his wife call his own father a very tired old man who could not tell the difference between owning something and being sentimentally attached to it. He heard her laugh, short and sharp, at the very idea of loyalty to a neighborhood, to a family, to anything at all that could not eventually be converted into a number on a spreadsheet somewhere. And then near the end, he heard the line Elia told me had broken something in him completely. The line about Dante himself becoming, once the paperwork cleared, somebody else's problem to manage. He did not cry, Elia told me, though she had fully expected him to. He sat very still for a long moment after the recording finished, staring at the dark screen of that little phone, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out flat and quiet in a way that frightened her more than shouting ever could have. "How long have you had this?" he asked her. She told him the truth. "Since the night in your office, since before you ever signed anything at all." He asked her why she had not shown him sooner, and Elia told me she gave him nearly the same answer I had given her weeks earlier, in almost the exact same words. "Because Grandpa said you needed to see it for yourself before anybody could simply tell you, or you would spend the rest of your life finding some way to blame it all on somebody else instead." He reached across the table then and took her hand, the same way I had once taken hers in a rented room 2 towns away, and told her he was sorry. Not for the first time that year, but for what Elia said was the first time it had ever actually sounded true coming out of his mouth. "Dante sat with that for a long time too," she said. Then he stood up slowly, walked to the drawer where he kept his charging cables, and pulled out his own phone with hands that had finally, for the first time in weeks, stopped shaking entirely. He dialed Colby Reyes at 9:40 on a Tuesday night, and when the young lawyer picked up, sounding half asleep and thoroughly alarmed at the hour, Dante told him something Elia said she will remember, word for word, for the rest of her own life. "I need to testify," Dante said. "All of it. Everything I did, and everything she did, and every single thing I let myself pretend I did not already know, somewhere underneath it all. I am done protecting the wrong person in this family, Colby. I am finished with it entirely." I sat alone in my room for a long while after Elia finally hung up that phone, turning her account of that whole evening over and over in my mind, and felt something in my chest ease for the first time in longer than I could easily remember. Not relief exactly. Something closer to the particular ache of watching a person finally begin walking, however unsteadily, in the direction of who they had always been capable of becoming. I walked into the Harris County Courthouse on my own 2 feet on a bright Tuesday morning, 3 weeks almost to the day after I had first watched a moving truck parked crooked outside Odell Fairweather's house, wearing the same charcoal suit I had worn to Odessa's funeral, because it was the only suit I owned that felt like it understood the weight of an occasion like this one. My hands did not shake climbing those courthouse steps, though my knees reminded me, as they always do these days, that 76 years is not nothing, no matter how straight a man tries to stand through it. I did not use a cane. I did not need one. I walked down that center aisle with my back straight and my eyes forward, and I heard the small startled intake of breath from the plaintiff's table before I ever reached it. Kylie was there after all, seated beside a lawyer I did not recognize, brought in 2 days earlier by federal marshals from a motel outside Lafayette, where she had been found paying for a room in cash under yet another name that was not quite her own. She did not look at me as I passed. She stared straight ahead at the empty space above the judge's bench, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. Dante sat at a separate table, entirely apart from her, beside his own attorney, and when our eyes met for the first time in nearly 3 weeks, he did not look away. That alone told me more than anything Whitaker had prepared me to expect from that particular morning. Alea sat 2 rows back in the gallery between Quentin and a woman I recognized after a moment as Pastor Ross's own wife. Her chin lifted and her eyes fixed steadily on the back of her father's head the entire time. The same patient watchfulness I had spent weeks teaching her now turned toward the one person in that room who most needed to feel it resting on him. Judge Diane Whitfield called the hearing to order, and Thomas Whitaker rose to present our case with the same unhurried, airtight thoroughness he had brought to every piece of paperwork we had built together over 8 careful years. He walked the court through the Community Land Trust, the Automatic Protective Clause, the timeline, proving the properties had already been legally locked before any transfer was even attempted. He introduced the forged deed itself. The biometric analysis confirming my true signature did not match the one filed, and the video Alea had captured through that garage window projected in silence onto a screen at the front of the courtroom, while the whole room watched my own son's hand commit a felony against me, one careful letter at a time. Nobody spoke while that video played. I did not look away from it either, though it cost me something real to keep watching. Then the recording played Kylie's voice, filling that entire silent room with words she had never once imagined would travel any further than a closed bedroom door. I watched several jurors in the gallery, seated there for an unrelated matter, visibly flinch at the line about people like him. I watched the judge's own expression go very still and very cold. When it was Dante's turn to testify, he did not ask for leniency. He stood, walked to the witness stand, and told the court in a voice I had not heard him use since he was a frightened boy, confessing to breaking a neighbor's window, the full truth of everything he had done and everything he had let himself pretend not to understand. He described the forgery in his own plain words, refusing his own lawyer's gentle attempts to soften the language for him. He described, too, the pressure Kylie had applied the folder she had prepared in advance, the calm certainty in her voice the night she told him it was just a formality. He did not once say, "She made me do it." He said several times, clearly and deliberately, that the choice to pick up that pen had been entirely his own to make. Kylie's attorney objected twice. Judge Whitfield overruled him twice, her patience for that particular table growing visibly thinner with each passing minute. When the testimony finally ended, Judge Whitfield did not take long to decide. She denied the guardianship petition in full, with prejudice declared the Community Land Trust valid and fully intact, and stated for the record that she found Mr. Pugh, meaning me, entirely competent to manage his own affairs, a finding she noted dryly she wished had not needed stating so plainly for a man who had just walked unassisted the full length of her courtroom. She ordered the county to refer Kylie Pugh's case immediately to the district attorney's office for prosecution on charges of fraud and forgery conspiracy. She noted for the record that Dante Pugh's voluntary complete testimony would be weighed accordingly by that same office, in whatever charges he ultimately faced himself in the months ahead. I did not feel triumphant hearing that gavel come down, the way I had once imagined I might feel sitting alone in a rented room planning for this exact morning. I looked across that courtroom at my son, sitting alone at his table with his hands folded in front of him, exactly the way Kylie's were folded at hers. And he looked back at me steady for the first time in longer than I could easily remember. I did not know yet in that moment whether there was enough road left between us to walk back toward each other. I only knew watching him hold my gaze without flinching away from it, that for the first time since this whole ordeal began, my son was finally standing in the truth instead of hiding from it. 6 weeks after that Sunday morning outside her porch, I stood in front of Odell Fairweather's door again, and this time the key turned smooth and easy in the lock, the way every key on this street was always meant to turn. Odell answered before I even finished knocking, pulled me into a hug that smelled like cinnamon and mothballs, and told me she had already heard the news from 3 different neighbors before I ever made it up her front steps myself. She still had the framed photograph she had clutched to her chest that terrible Sunday morning sitting right back in its place on the mantel. And she made a point of showing it to me again, as though we both needed the reminder that some things really can be put back exactly where they belong. The community land trust expanded now with Whitaker's careful help, and the small settlement nobody in my own family will ever see a penny of had grown from 4 houses to 11, absorbing 3 more small rentals along Willow Bend, whose owners had been quietly approached by developers just like Judson Woodward in the months since my own trouble became briefly and uncomfortably neighborhood news. Pastor Ross says we are the only street left in this whole part of the city where an old woman can still afford to grow old in the house she raised her children in. I do not know if that is entirely true. I know it is true enough for me to keep doing the paperwork every year without a single complaint. I drove out to the cemetery that same afternoon, something I do most months now that I finally have my truck back, and sat with Odessa for a while, the way I always do, telling her about the 11 houses instead of 4, about Eliah's pre-law applications, about all of it. I do not know if she can hear any of what I tell her out there. I have decided at 76 years old that it does not much matter either way. Some conversations are worth having, regardless of who is actually listening on the other end. Alea drove me down that street a few Saturdays later, the 2 of us moving slow with the windows down, and I found myself narrating the whole route out loud, the way I used to narrate it to her as a little girl riding along beside me on my actual mail truck, a lifetime and a whole different kind of trouble ago. She is starting her first semester of pre-law classes this fall, closer to home than either of us ever expected, and she told me somewhere around the 4th block that she still is not sure yet whether she wants to prosecute people like Kylie or defend people like her own father. I told her she has years yet to decide, and that either choice would make her grandmother proud beyond measure. She reached over at a red light and squeezed my hand, the same gesture I had first offered her in a rented room 2 towns away passed back to me now the way the best things in a family always eventually find their way back around. Dante and I are not where we once were, and I will not stand here and tell you we are further along than we actually are. He calls most Sundays now. Sometimes I let it go to voicemail, not out of anger anymore, but because forgiveness, real forgiveness, is not a door that swings open all at once. It opens the width of one careful conversation at a time, the same way any door ever does, the same way this whole story ever moved forward at all. 2 weeks ago, he asked if he could come by and help me clear the gutters before the fall rain started up. I said yes. We did not talk about Kylie's case working its slow way through a courtroom neither one of us particularly wants to sit in again. We did not talk about the charges he still quietly faces of his own. We talked about gutters and ladders, and how his hands, I noticed, had finally stopped shaking entirely. At one point, balanced awkwardly on a ladder I have owned longer than he has been alive, he asked me, almost shy about it, whether I remembered teaching him to use a level the summer he turned 12. I told him I remembered every summer, every single one, better than he probably thinks I do. It is not everything. It is, I have come to believe, exactly enough for right now. I have delivered a great many things to the people on this street over the years. Letters and parcels and the occasional piece of bad news nobody particularly wanted to receive. I understand now, in a way I did not fully understand before any of this happened, that the most important thing I ever delivered to any of them was simply proof that somebody was still paying attention, that somebody still believed a door worth walking through was worth protecting properly. That is a strange thing for an old man to learn this late in his own life. But I have found that the truest lessons rarely arrive on any schedule a person would have chosen for themselves. If there is a lesson in any of this, it is only that. Pay attention to the people who built the ground you are standing on. Protect what deserves protecting, even when protecting it costs you comfort, even when it costs you someone you love. And never ever let anybody convince you that sentiment and value are two separate things. Because in my experience, the two have always been exactly the same thing, simply wearing different names.